the church is quite regularly faced with the fact that it has to answer a question, not just on the basis of advisable and inadvisable, but on the basis of true or false. Part of the rule of faith or not part of the rule of faith. Consistent with the scripture, inconsistent with the scripture. I think a lot of younger evangelicals think that all of that is in the past. I don't think it is.
No, I think, for example, all of the issues relative to sexuality and identity, they're certainly being posed in new and pointed ways that the church has not seen before. And that raises, the interesting question of, do we need to expand our creeds and confessions to allow for that? My gut instinct on all of these questions is we mustn't do that until we've really decided that the documents we have are inadequate to the task. So I used the example of gay marriage earlier. It seems to me that the positive teaching we find in traditional Protestant confessions about marriage, be they Lutheran, Baptist, or Presbyterian, is quite adequate for dealing with gay marriage because it sets forth what the truth is and therefore by implication excludes all of the false claimants to marriage. But I wouldn't want to rule out the possibility of something emerging that might require at some point an addition to a confession. I'd rather not go there because the history of confessional revision is not generally an encouraging one. Confessions tend to move away from orthodoxy rather than deeper into it when they're revised. No necessary reason why that should happen. It's just the sinfulness of the human heart, I think, in play there. But I'm not. I think if you're a confessionalist, you have to be committed to the idea, hypothetically, that the church, and I do stress the church and not any individual, the church may wish to modify or add to its confessional statement.
So this is the only point at which I think you're just wrong and like dangerously wrong. And I say that with a smile. So we're friends talking here. But I think it's also because you're a Presbyterian and I'm a Baptist, partly. So and you're probably thinking, well, you're absolutely right about that. But anyway, what I and you and I've had some discussions of this over the years, and maybe part of it is the difference as you might articulate in terms of why you wrote the second edition with Identity Politics. Maybe it's because of standpoint epistemology, or maybe it's because of the difference in social location. I'm president of an institution, of a theological seminary and a college. I am a leader in an evangelical denomination, and I'm very, very active in the legal defense of Christian institutions, Christian schools, Christian ministries. Yeah. And so the listeners know how friendly this is, but I do want to say that we are going to be in a increasingly vulnerable situation if, when it comes to something like gender claims made by the LGBTQ movement and all the rest, we can't say this is a matter of explicit creedal authority.
Right.
I have a way of resolving that, and so I think you're right. And I've had lots of discussions, which we can just say, we. In a friendly way, we discussed this before, but I've been a part of developing such statements as the Nashville Statement, and I wasn't there to form the Danvers Statement, but in affirming it, I can tell you that legally and procedurally, I could not have led to the reform of this institution without those documents having creedal status.
Right.
But I don't. I just want to say this. I want to turn it back to you. I believe the right way to deal with that is not to revise the historic confession, but rather for a governing board or for the elders or the congregation, depending on the polity, to adopt this statement as a necessary, creedally binding interpretation of what was meant by the historic confession.
Yeah, and Presbyterians, we have a sort of equivalent of that. I think I'm right in saying that the PCA adopted the Nashville Statement.
Yes.
Not as a kind of, not on the same level as the Westminster Confession, because there's a sense in which the issues the Nashville Statement addresses, I don't think they will, but may disappear one day and become sort of, like a statement on lobotomies might have been 100 years ago. So we'd be scratching our heads now, wondering why. But adopted it as you say, as a kind of, this is what we see the clear implications of our confessional position being. And in the OPC, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, my denomination, we, like the PCA, we also produce these General Assembly reports that are not considered to be confessional, but our ways of, you could produce a report on sexuality, which essentially says, these are what we think the implications of the confession are, and this is how we think our ministers should operate. So we're getting towards the kind of thing, I think, that you're pointing to there. I certainly don't want to say that, a confession written in the 17th century can do everything for the church today.
Right.
I think it provides a good document for defining the church doctrinally, but it can't carry the weight of everything that the church needs to do doctrinally within the context in which we find ourselves.
Which is one of the reasons why I think so. In other words, I wouldn't have done this if it wasn't a friendly conversation, but I hope it's really helpful to listeners. And, I'm in constant conversation with headmasters of Christian schools, with pastors of Christian churches, presidents, CEOs of Christian organizations, and with the lawyers that are helping us in this. And, they're generally applicable principles of law that, for instance, how do you assert that your church properly on the basis of an exercise of religious conviction asserts this to be true? How do you prove that to be true? Well, in court, it certainly helps if you're having to defend yourself, for instance, against charges that you're violating civil rights by saying that a boy's a boy and a girl's a girl in your school. That's not hypothetical anymore. It certainly helps if you go into court to say, here is where there is a Christian statement consistent with, the creedal and confessional history of our church. And one of the ways you can do that is, I think, by saying this statement helps us to understand and is a necessary implication of this historic creed. I think you've made the point very well, and I thank you for making this point, that the best way is not to go back and say, take the formula of Concord and revise it, but rather to say, if you're Lutheran, that this is a necessary implication of what is asserted there.
Yes, and I think just sort of bouncing off that again, for anyone listening, if you're a member of a church or a pastor of a church with a 12-point doctrinal statement as your standard, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's great to have a doctrinal standard. I don't mean to sort of dismiss that, but you probably need at this point to consult lawyers, because almost certainly your 12-point doctrinal statement will not give you the kind of foundation that you've been pointing to there as very important. And, I'd urge pastors, elders, elder boards, get some legal advice.
That's right.
Relative to your confessional document, however big or however small it is, to make sure that you're anticipating potential problems that could be coming down the line. I think a lot of churches did that with gay marriage, but the gender thing, that's the new thing on the horizon.
Well, and this is where things are more difficult. And, I'm kind of in deep water on this in terms of my personal involvement with churches, institutions, denominations, and the courts. And that is that, there is a statement concerning marriage in a lot of the historic Christian creeds and confessions. And just to take, for example, if you're in the Anglican tradition, you have everything you need in the Book of Common Prayer, the church, you have everything you need, except courage to apply it in the present, by the way, but that's another story. But,
ouch.
Yes, but at least in the documents, you have everything you need. But on the question of gender, because of the way it's being asserted, and, I think this is to lead into the final part of our conversation. I think that's a part of the reason why you wrote this book, is because of the ideological contaminants that and expressive individualism and all the rest. But our creeds, even when it asserts male and female, were not written to defend against someone saying, well, I declare myself to be female.
Yes, and that's where you really need to, the areas of the creeds and confessions that need to be scrutinized in this particular context are those dealing with creation and anthropology. And at the moment, when I look at the Westminster Confession, I think we have enough there, pastorally at least, to govern our churches and to pastor our people. But not to put too fine a point on it, it is impossible to predict the next level of craziness that could be hitting the beach.
Absolutely.
And that's where I think we need to be constantly vigilant and leave, as I say, hypothetically, we have to allow that revisions or supplements could be made or added to our confessions. I don't like the idea of doing that. As I say, it's not an unproblematic thing to do for a number of reasons. But as you say, when all of the classical categories, which are in many ways assumed by the confessional documents, are now being dismantled and thrown away, it does raise a new level of urgency in terms of looking at our confessional documents and thinking about them relative to that.